Hi, I'd just like to say a few words on the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin, which took place in the Kremlin on February the 6th and was broadcast just last night. I'm talking to you on Friday, February the 8th. Broadcast on Tucker Carlson's website, free to view. I thought it was astonishing and consequential in a number of ways. The first and obvious takeaway is just the historical sweep that Vladimir Putin possesses, his command of his brief, his mastery or his of geopolitical affairs in the current landscape, and also historical events in the manner of a man who's been trained in the Soviet school of dialectical thinking from the a la Karl Marx. Simply put, he understands the role of cause and effect in the direction of human affairs, and he also understands that in the West we see a decline and a debasement and a degeneration in our politics due to the blind adherence to a failed ideology of imperialism, hegemony, and domination. And this came over in the 2 hours he spoke without notes, which stands in marked contradistinction to his counterparts in the West. And just in parenthesis, around the same time as this Carlson interview was aired, Joe Biden gave an impromptu press conference to rail against a DOJ report over his retention of classified documents in his garage while VP, which said it was described him as an elderly gentleman with a poor memory. In this regard, I think the DOJ report was kind to Biden, because when he railed against this accusation, he ironically referred to President Sisi of Egypt as the President of Mexico. And when you consider that his Republican opponent in all but name in the 2024 election, I think it's clear now that Trump's going to be a shoo-in. When you think that Trump is the alternative, you understand that what we're dealing with is US imperial decline, with two men who are vying for the keys to an empire whose crimes would shame all the devils in hell. A gerontocracy, they appear at times in history where a given state or empire is reaching its nadir. We saw this with the demise of Rome, and now we're seeing it with the demise of this American empire. And so in many ways, the main challenge facing the world, or the rest of the world, is managing this decline, because we have entered a very dangerous period as America enters or has entered its mad dog days, supporting genocide in Gaza and supporting and funding the war in Ukraine, using Ukraine as a proxy to advance American hegemonic interests in Eastern Europe. So Putin laid all this out, and Tucker Carlson deserves credit. He didn't try and land any heavy blows. He listened. And only if Western leaders had listened to Putin in the same way might this brutal conflict in Ukraine, which had been going on for far too long, have been averted. One of the stunning takeaways from the interview was the nefarious role that Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson played in scuppering a peace deal which was on the table in Istanbul within the first few weeks of the conflict beginning. How many men would have been spared? How many families would not have been grieving? How many people would not have been wounded, murdered on the altar of US hegemonic intrigue in that part of the world? As I have written, for the Western ideologue, Russia can only ever exist as either a deadly foe or a defeated enemy. There is no in between. Russia delenda-esque, in the words of Cato the Elder, when he used to give speeches in advance of the Third Punic War, he would end every speech, Carthago delenda-esque, Carthage must be destroyed. That's the same mantra that colonises the hearts and minds of Western ideologues in Europe and especially in Washington. And it's been responsible for an entire industry being established. Think tanks, the arms industry, all have profited from this exercise in the demonization of Russia, enmity towards Russia, the painting of Putin's Russia as an enemy that is a threat to all right-thinking Americans and Europeans and our cultural, civilizational values, whatever the fuck they are, at the start of 2024. I don't think they even know themselves. Such has been societal breakdown and the role of culture wars across the West in the wake of the demise of neoliberalism as a viable economic model, a corpse that's yet to be buried in the wake of the 2008 financial and then global economic crash. So we are where we are. Putin is no saint. He's no Nelson Mandela, he's no Mahatma Gandhi, but he is the leader of Russia at a brutal time in human affairs. He's a leader that that country needs, or certainly needed up to this point. He is credited with steering the country out of the failed experiment in free market economics that was forced upon the country in the wake of the demise of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, where the Russian people suffered far worse economic plight than their American counterparts did during the Great Depression in the 1930s, where 1989, as Naomi Klein outlines in her wonderful book, and I advise you to read this book if you already have, Shock Doctrine. She makes the point, the salient point, that in 1989, when the Soviet Union was still extinct, 2 million people in Russia were living in poverty as per the World Bank Index, which has a metric of $4 a day. People living on $4 a day. By 1997, that number had gone up to 79 million. 79 million. You do the maths, out of a country of 150 million. That's almost, if not more than half of the population reduced to poverty due to the failed free market experiment in human despair that was brought against them in the wake of the demise of the Soviet Union. Putin also points out, which I knew already, that in his early days as president of Russia, when he came to power in 2000, he asked then US President Bill Clinton, when Clinton visited him in Moscow, if it would be possible, if it might ever be possible, that Russia could join NATO. So here we are, 24 years later, and Russia has been declared the sworn enemy of everything holy in the UK, the US, and across Western Europe. But these people, our leaders, are not acting in our interests. Russia's their enemy, it's not our enemy. These people want you to think that they're our allies when they're not. I've made the point before and I'll make it again. We live in societies that exist, that are predicated on class oppression at home and militarism overseas. And these leaders who run systems that are anti-human, that are barbaric, that have normalised destitution at one end and normalised obscene wealth at the other, they need to frighten us, like frightening the kids, in order to keep us wedded to their interests, which are malign in terms of our interests. And so they have to fashion always a bogeyman abroad. In this event, we've got Russia, North Korea, we've got Iran, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Fidel Castro played that role, Nasser going back to the 1950s in Egypt. Time and time again, they need a bogeyman to justify the status quo, as I say, of class oppression at home and militarism overseas. But anyway, if you haven't yet seen the Tucker Carlson interview, I would recommend that you do so. It's probably the most important interview of any world leader in modern times. They tried their best to cancel Russia. They tried their best to prevent us from seeing anything of Putin and listening to the man. And I think if you do, you might come to a new understanding of what's going on in Ukraine and why, and more broadly, what's been going on in our world. So anyway, that's all from me. just thought I'd say a few words on this interview. Peace out.